Well, one, thank you for coming. I'm Michael Correia, Director of Government Relations for the National Cannabis Industry Association. And just a little background about myself. I moved to Washington, D.C. in 1996. And I grew up in California, Southern California. And when I moved out in November of 96 is when California passed the ballot initiative 215, which legalized medical marijuana, which was the first in the country. And I remember going back to visit my family over the years and seeing advertisements in newspapers and magazines, and they would talk about marijuana and medicine. And I consumed cannabis, i.e., smoked pot, when I was a teenager. And I remember going back and going, yeah, right, wink, wink, medicine. Sure, this is. I have a backache. Oh, that's medicine. And so, one, there was always that in the back of my head. I grew up in the Just Say No 80s. And I always looked at this as something teenagers did. This was rebellion. There was no medicine associated with it. I've been lobbying for the industry for 4 years now, and it's actually blown my mind that the medical applications and the benefits that can come from this plant. I have a 3-year-old daughter who, knock on wood, is as healthy as can be, and the fact that there could be a politician or someone that would stand between me, my daughter, and a doctor to get medicine that could affect them is really amazing. The fact that in this day and age, people still have to go through that. Adult use is one thing, but having access to medicine that could benefit a returning vet with PTSD, your grandfather with cancer, your neighbor, your mother who has MS, any cancers, something like that that could benefit, is really one of the reasons why I have really support this issue and have really tried to advocate on this issue. That's something that's really important to me. And so my job is, I'm a lobbyist. I represent the trade association for the cannabis industry. We are 1,500 members. We are the national voice of the cannabis industry. My job is lobbying Congress at the federal level and basically increasing the visibility of the industry, lobbying. And our main issues that I address in Congress relate to the banking issue. A lot of our businesses do not have access to financial services. They don't have access to banking services, and they're kept from being treated like every other small business in America. And another is related to taxes, that our businesses are not able to write off standard business deductions on their federal tax reforms. And so that keeps them from being treated like every other small business in America. And so my focus at the federal level, although I care about legalization is years away. My focus right now is getting Congress to change the laws that respect the states and allow the states to be able to go forward and operate in a safe spot. And so here I am speaking a couple weeks ago in Las Vegas with a couple members of Congress. And just give you some of the background. A lot of the other speakers are going to talk about sort of the applications and the advocacy that they deal with. And I sort of, when I put this panel together, I thought about doing this sort of life cycle of the plant. And one of them is a parent perspective of what it's like to advocate for your child that could access medicine, to deal with the research, the barriers to research, to being able to get some of the answers that they're looking for so we can actually determine if there are medical benefits to something like this. And then to hear the advocacy end of what the advocates sort of deal with on Capitol Hill and what they're pushing. That whole cycle of the plant so people really understand from beginning to end. And I'll give a more of a political, and mine was I want to answer questions, I want to get to you guys, and I want to keep this short to listen to some of the other panelists. But on the public opinion side, you see the graph. This is the public opinion over the past 40 plus years. And you see there was a noticeable spike 20 years ago going up. I personally believe that has to do with the broad use of the internet. And one of the things is you can directly get messages out to the public. I grew up in the 80s. When you learned about drugs, it was through your police, it was through government officials, it was through the church. They could lie to us, and there was no other way to get information. Now, any 16-year-old can type in marijuana on the internet and get an idea of some of the background. and you've seen the public opinion shoot up. These numbers are constantly going up. Every demographic group is supportive, and this one, the red line, deals with Republicans, and you see finally that it reached the majority. And when you break down demographic groups, the only group that did not overwhelmingly support this tended to be older white males, which is, we know, the modern day Republican Party. And so you've seen that on Capitol Hill. You've seen general acceptance on medical marijuana at the 80+%. You see the public support on adult use legalization between 52, 60, 61%. There's a noticeable 20 to 30% difference. And when I deal with politicians on the Hill, you notice that. You see that. There's this general acceptance that medical marijuana is okay, but adult use, you see a lot of politicians that put their hands up. I don't believe in legalization, but I support medical marijuana, and I support the research. Capitol Hill lags public opinion by 3 to 5 years, so you are finally seeing Congress come around to what maybe we were thinking 3 years ago or 5 years ago, or that's so 2010. And so some of the legislation we deal with, we have a banking bill. We call it the Safe Banking Act. There's a bill in the House. There's a bill in the Senate that addresses the banking issue. We have another bill that addresses the tax issue, and you all know that tax reform is going on right now. And we have an amendment that would address this. And our goal is, it's not favoritism for the cannabis industry, it's just to be treated fairly. Who is driving this is not industry, the consumer is actually driving this. And so what they've seen over the past couple of years in Colorado is that the regulated market is filling the void that was filled by the Mexican cartels and the drug cartels. They're not creating new customers, they're just filling the needs of customers that were already there. And so I remember being at a hearing a couple years ago, and the DEA was testifying, and they basically said it was 1 in 3 Americans had consumed cannabis at one time in their life, and I think 20 million regularly do it within the past 90 days, which is mind-blowing when you think about what type of usage. There's always been that demand there, and it is better to address that demand in a regulated market. Every fear that you have about marijuana is not being addressed in a illicit black market. The only way you can address some of these fears is to tax it, regulate it. If you have issues with labeling, if you have issues with dosage, if you have issues with testing what's in it, the only way you're able to address a lot of these issues is in a regulated market. And that's what we're hoping for. We're not, our opponents will say we're big tobacco, big alcohol 2.0, which could be further from the truth. I would love it if I were some big lobbyist making hundreds of thousands of dollars. I work at a nonprofit. Maybe one of these days I'll be able to get to that point. But I am just advocating for a lot of our businesses are just small businesses. They're just trying to survive. They're 2, 3, 4 persons. Some of our bigger operators, they have hundreds of employees. But what we're trying to do is just create a system to where the consumer, the American public, is getting what they had originally requested in the first place. The state of the industry, you see there are 8 states right now that have adult use where any adults can consume cannabis. There are, I think it's about 29 states right now that have some working medical marijuana programs. And there are a handful of states, I can't keep up because it's constantly changing. There's this component of the cannabis plant called CBD, which there have been a lot, you've all heard of Charlotte's Web. There have been a lot of benefits of kids with epilepsy. And so what this map shows is basically the black are the states that don't have anything. There are 45 states that are openly defined federal law right now. And so this is what one of the objects we're trying to get to Congress is that they're already breaking these laws. They're already going forward. It's time that Congress stepped up and allowed these states to be able to go forward at whatever speed they wanted to go forward. And this graph just shows you how these states are going forward. If you follow the news, there will probably, I just saw something where the governor of Vermont said he's okay with the legislature legalizing cannabis. In early 2018, you're going to have 3, 4, 5 more states probably legalize medicinal use over the past probably probably within the next 12 months, and a couple others legalize adult use through the legislature. The House of Representatives, you see the breakdown, you see where all the Republican support is, and you see the Democratic support, and this was a really big one. This map, if you sort of go back, matches up very close to this. Our states with legalization efforts tend to be Democratic blue states, and it's very hard for Congress to want to move forward with something that's really not in their backyard. Congress has 5 committee chairs that are from Texas. Texas has nothing. It's really hard to move legislation through to address some of these issues when the leadership of Congress is not allowing it. This past year in 2016, there were 9 states that had some ballot initiative on. We won 8 of them. The only state that didn't win was adult use in Arizona, and it was funny that the campaign, the funder of the campaign opposed to it was the drug company that made fentanyl that killed Prince, killed a lot of other people. And here they were with a drug that kills people saying marijuana is unsafe. And I think it's hypocritical. Luckily, the CEO, one of the leaders, is going to jail for fraud. And so I think it's a good comeback. The other thing that we deal with is every year Congress has to fund the government. And 3.5 years ago, we got a provision in law. It was called the Rohrabacher-Farr provision that basically said, Justice Department, you can't spend any money interfering with states with state legal medical marijuana programs. And so basically what that has allowed is these states to operate in a safe spot. This provision has been in law for 3 years now. But Congress has not done a budget in years, and the House version has stripped out this amendment, and there's a lot of uncertainty going forward of whether the states are going to be able to operate in any safe spot. We are the trade association. Here, once a year, we bring our members in to lobby Congress. Here we had about 250, 300 of our members. As you notice, there's no dreadlocks. These are cannabis business operators. They're small businesses. We wanted to show members of Congress that this is the face of the cannabis industry. And when we had done our lobby days in 2014, I remember the Washington Post had done a story about us, and the lead was how we were dressed. And the fact that we were wearing pants made front page news. And so it was one of those things to where we have a lot of obstacles going against us is getting through just the perception of what cannabis is and how it's us versus them. And a lot of what this is, a lot of the lobbying to educate members just on some of the issues. That's the bigger political issue. And why did I want to talk about that? Because a lot of the medical is only able to operate if there's a safe space for them to operate. And like I mentioned, one of the things I want to do is talk about the life cycle. And I had the privilege of meeting Gail years ago as an advocate for the movement because of her son. And she has now become involved in the industry. Gail's going to come up next to speak, and it's a wonderful. This is who I'm fighting for, is people like Gail. So they, with my young daughter, to be able to treat their child and have access to something is very important to me. And so I wanted to introduce Gail and just get into why I'm fighting for this and why it's important we have this safe political view at the federal level. So thank you.
I need hands. So Michael just talked about some people throughout the country who are doing this illegally. That's me. I'm one of those, federally illegally growing the plant. I did want to kind of tell you a little bit more about myself. This is my son, Logan. I'm going to bring this over here, actually. So he's the reason why I got in this industry. I realized that I wanted to give Logan, when he was 4 years old, a chance to be able to try this medicine. Problem was, I knew absolutely nothing about politics or about cannabis. So I did what any other normal mom would do, I sent my holiday cards to every single senator and delegate in the state of Maryland. I just changed the words a little bit to say, I'm hoping you can make 2014 brighter by allowing my son with epilepsy to get the medical cannabis he needs. This was authentically me, and I just wanted to communicate my message. I was what I call an accidental advocate. It wasn't something I planned on. It was something that evolved over time. But why did I think medical cannabis would help Logan? So my son Logan was born healthy, met every developmental milestone. At age 12 months, he started having seizures. He would have staring-type seizures, which evolved into what's called drop seizures. I kind of like to say they're like a marionette whose strings were cut off, and immediately he would fall to the ground. Here's a picture of Logan with his older siblings who are typically developing, and 1 second he's happy and everybody's enjoying themselves, and you can tell how quickly life changes in just a second. My older kids didn't even get a chance to realize what had happened before he was having a drop seizure. We unfortunately had to visit the emergency room quite often. He's had stitches 7 times from his seizures. He's had a total of 14,000 seizures since he's diagnosed. My husband and I are both accountants, so we track everyone. His age of diagnosis was 1.5. We think it kind of went back to when he was 12 months old, but we didn't really acknowledge it and get diagnosed until he was 1.5. He tried 6 different pharmaceuticals. He also tried a diet called the ketogenic diet, which was extremely challenging to administer. We had to weigh everything to a 1/10 of a gram that went into his body. It's a high-fat diet that does help some kids, but did not help my son. He's had 6 different medical tests and procedures. We've consulted 8 different neurologists all over the country to try to find a solution. Research coming out of Johns Hopkins, though, said that after you've tried 4 anti-seizure meds, the chance of you finding seizure control from these meds is less than 1%. Not to mention some of the side effects from the meds. These were just the side effects from the meds that he was on. He didn't have this side effect, but this is the possible side effect from these medicines. He had several other side effects, including insomnia, including loss of appetite, including just the fact that he was completely lethargic on a lot of the medicines. But my little guy doesn't give up, and neither were we willing to do that. So I had a friend who I met through the epilepsy group that Logan has called DOSA syndrome. Her name was Heather, and she emailed me in 2012 saying that she was going to try medical cannabis for her son, Zakai. Zakai ended up going, she was in Colorado, so she had legal access to the plant there. Zakai ended up going seizure-free for 3 years, and his EEG, which measures brain waves, was far better control under cannabis than it was under any other medicine. So this made me sit up and listen. And then there was some information coming out of New York, a neurologist that some of my friends had seen through their typical treatment plan, who was basically saying that for kids with treatment-resistant epilepsy, the toll it takes on their deadly consequences of their seizures, and it's compounded by the side effects of the medicines. But then he went on to say that as a doctor, I would gladly prescribe marijuana products for many of my patients who failed existing therapies as if it was legal in his state, which it is now, but it was not then at the time of the quote. And then the Epilepsy Foundation came out also in 2014 to say nothing should stand in the way of patients gaining access to this potentially life-saving treatment. So with sort of the support of some of the medical community and the Epilepsy Foundation, I co-founded Stop the Seizures in Maryland, and together with incredible parent advocates, we passed a bill here in Maryland, or close in Maryland. I've always said that this is not a Republican or a Democratic issue, medical cannabis. I believe it's an issue that affects people who are suffering and people whose loved ones are suffering. So I've seen advocacy work. I'm pleased to say, actually today, possibly as we speak, there's medical cannabis dispensaries that are opening for patients in Maryland. But I did kind of want to also explain, how did this translate to a medical cannabis business for me? I had absolutely no intention of joining the industry. I advocated to get this medicine for my son. However, my background as a CPA and a systems consultant and a lean process improvement consultant sort of lent itself to joining a team. I joined ForwardGro. And I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about ForwardGro and why I joined that team. For one, I felt strongly about the importance of the environment, and we're using growing in a greenhouse, one of two of the 15 entities in Maryland that are going to be growing in a greenhouse. I thought it's very important to use the solar energy. My team also had really traditional agriculture experience. A lot of people think this plant's a weed and it's easy to grow. On a large scale, when you're growing for medicine, you want to grow consistently. You want to be able to ensure your lab testing is consistent. It's a pretty complicated plant, and it's very important. I also felt like the principals on my team were just genuine people. I felt like their intentions were good and they were honest about their intentions, and I think that was very, very important to me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the sustainability. Here's our facility over here. And when we're watering the plants, we use water from the lakes that are on the property. And we also use, you'll see in a little bit, here's a picture of our greenhouse, and you can see the sun here growing the plants. We also use drip irrigation, so we take the water from the lakes, and it goes specifically right into the plant so that we can reduce the runoff pretty significantly. And if there is any small amount of runoff, that water goes right back into our lakes and then keeps going through our watering system and gets filtered. We also have, in the back, you can see there's some fans and some vents, I guess is the word I'm using. And we also have some fans over here. So we have several different cooling methods that we're using. We don't use air conditioning that heats up the area that we then have to cool. Sorry, we don't use the lights as much, so we don't have to cool them with air conditioning. We do have lights in our facility that we do use as needed based on a cloudy day or to extend the plant life cycle. Wanted to show a couple pictures of the progress, mostly because I just think it's super exciting. Here's our plants. This was a while back. I think some of these flowers very possibly might have been converted into processed materials that's being sold today. So I did want to talk a little bit more about the program and explain a little bit more about, our journey to roll out the program from the law and the regulation perspective. But just so I have a sense, how many people here are actually from Maryland? Okay, so quite a bit. I also, if I may, this next slide I'm going over I borrowed from a presentation from Debbie Mirren, who's sitting right there, who was one of the inaugural members of the Maryland Medical Cannabis Commission, and she, I know personally, was an extraordinarily important representative who drove not just the law, but the regulations with a complete focus on the patients every step of the way. So I can't tell her how much I owe her for everything she did. So part of the reason the principles of the program are so good is because of that woman right there. So. But it is important for me to address because this is from a policy perspective, this is what I think how Maryland rolled out. So ensure proper security and protection of public safety, assure the highest quality medicine is produced and distributed, expedite patient access. Well, it's here now, so we'll give that one a check mark. The program costs were not funded by Maryland taxpayers, and the program costs were entirely paid for by fees from the licensed entities. So another thing that I think is really strong about our program is I felt like there was an incredibly strong balance between the patients and the industry and the medical providers. Sometimes those get in conflict, and I think the balance that was achieved in Maryland is exceptional. The quantity limits are high, which allows some patients that need a lot of medicine to treat whatever their treatment is allows flexibility for them to get the medicine they need. The medical provider participation, it's not just physicians in Maryland, it's nurse practitioners, it's dentists, it's podiatrists, nurse midwives, I'm not sure if I even have them all, but, and it's easy for them to participate. So you can go to potentially your traditional provider who provides you medical and talk to them about medical cannabis. And routes of administration. Edibles are not allowed in Maryland, but everything else is allowed. And I think that's extremely important because different people, my son will not smoke this. He would hopefully get it in a tincture where he would get an oil that he would put under his mouth. So I think it's important to be allowed different options. Our program is based in science. Definitely not going to talk too much about that. Again, I'm an accountant, so I'm not going to talk too much about the science side. But there is independent lab testing. No product can leave our facility until it's been lab tested. It's tested for potency, purity, microbiology, and it's literally limited in our system that we actually cannot get it out the door until an independent lab frees it up in our system to let it go. Here's an example. This is the very first plant in Maryland, something we're very proud of. We were the first to get licensed, so that is literally plant number 1 here in Maryland. We track every single plant in our facility. The state can see at any given time how many plants we have in all the different rooms. We also have I sometimes say that we're in the compliance industry. We just happen to sell plants. That's very much so what a huge part of our business is. We definitely have all the same compliance as OSHA. We also have a patient-focused certification through Americans for Safe Access, which is like a good housekeeping seal for medicine. We kind of take that very seriously throughout every practice that we do. We have standard operating procedures that drive our process. I think David's going to talk more about that later, right? There's our compliance officer working real time to track the plants and see where they are at any given moment. I'm going to talk a little bit about the conditions. Maryland has a specific list of conditions, including anorexia, wasting syndrome, seizures, nausea, pain. They also specifically lay out diseases, glaucoma and PTSD. There's also an additional criteria if you don't have one of those conditions or you don't have one of the specific diseases, that if your medical provider believes that your condition is severe, other medicine hasn't been effective, and that possibly your symptoms could be reasonably treated with cannabis, then they can also recommend under those standards. So I'm not looking to give you an advertisement on how to be part of the program. I just think it's interesting to kind of walk through it very quickly so that you understand how access in Maryland would work. So the first thing you do is you register as a patient or a caregiver in the commission. In order for a child under the age of 18 to participate in the program, they have to have a caregiver who's a legal guardian. So that's my situation with my son. And then you would meet with your bona fide medical provider. You have to have an existing relationship with them. They have to continue to monitor your treatment. And then you get what's called a written certification. I think it's important to address. I know one of the quotes earlier uses the term prescription. It is actually not a prescription. What medical providers are doing by giving you a written certification is they're exercising their First Amendment right of free speech to say you might benefit from medical cannabis. They're doing no more than that. They're not dosing it. They're not telling you what type of medicine you would need. The reason that's important is because cannabis is a Schedule I drug, and they need to be protected legally to be able to do that. And then the legal patient would access medicine in a licensed dispensary. So in Maryland, there's 3 different licenses: cultivation, which is what I have; processors that convert the medicine from plants into oils or topicals or lotions or capsules or pills or lozenges, etc., to be able to access the medicine. So now I guess I just wanted to turn to you all, trying to get a little help from our friends, my new friends today that I've met. And all I'm going to ask of you is that, when cannabis comes up in discussion at work or in your research or at a dinner party, that you help to reduce the stigma by just educating people about how medical cannabis really works in Maryland, as an example, or some of the other research that you're going to learn about today, and just help spread the message a little bit that this is medicine and it can help a lot of people. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. My name is David Mangone. I'm the Legislative Analyst with Americans for Safe Access. We're the largest nonprofit dedicated to medical and therapeutic uses of marijuana, or as I'll use interchangeably throughout the presentation, cannabis. We have over 100,000 members in all 50 states, Guam, Puerto Rico, obviously the District of Columbia, as well as an international arm in Prague that does a lot of our international research. I'm going to start highlighting some of the things that Mike touched on with public support right now. there's few other issues, I think, across the spectrum where there's such bipartisan support than there is, particularly for the legalization of medical cannabis. A Quinnipiac poll in April of this year showed that there was 94% voter support on this issue of over 1,000 people surveyed. And that was across party lines with 90% of Republicans and 95% of Democrats. So to have a Congress that hasn't acted on something with this much significant public support is really, I think, troubling to a lot of the people that we work with, a lot of the patients, and a lot of the other advocates. Another important aspect of the polling is the American Legion, the American Legion this fall, a group that's not traditionally associated with cannabis advocacy, released this polling showing that 92% of veterans believe that research should be increased to medical cannabis. So to have public support above 90, veteran support above 94, it really sort of begs the question, where is the holdup in congressional action? And even for people in Congress who are not necessarily supporters of marijuana or cannabis, there is often a compelling argument for them that this is a federalism issue, that states should be able to decide what policies they want to implement under the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment allows states to protect the health, welfare, and safety of their citizens, so anything related to drug policy would fall under that purview. So that's how we've been able to win over, I think, a lot of traditional conservatives who generally align themselves very, very far from anything related to cannabis, but they do believe that if states' voters have decided that this is the decision they want to make, that that decision should be respected by the federal government. So as I mentioned, there's several roadblocks right now why I think that there hasn't been a substantive vote on cannabis legislation in the House or in the Senate. And the first is that we hear a lot of comments of data versus opinion-driven policy. There's many lawmakers who rely exclusively on National Institutes of Health, National Institute of Drug Abuse, the DEA, the Department of Justice when they make their policy decisions. As I'll discuss a little bit later, those research studies that come from these organizations tend to be limited, and I think that a lot of lawmakers put their blinders on to international studies and privately funded studies when it comes to having a robust discussion about research. Another roadblock is that I think a lot of lawmakers don't treat this as a primary issue for them. They say, well, I have to deal with tax reform, I have to deal with health care, I have to deal with veterans issues. But a lot of them don't realize that these issues are all interwoven with cannabis policy. When you look at the veterans policy, the Veterans Affairs system is the largest healthcare provider in the United States, and you have a significant number of veterans that are suffering from PTSD, chronic pain, and other traumatic injuries, where the recommendation of cannabis from their healthcare provider could really help them in their treatment. But that conversation isn't being had due to internal policy. And then I have 27 agencies right here. These agencies would all be involved in a cannabis, if cannabis policy were to be changed, all of these agencies would have to ultimately have a say. Some of these are a little bit more clear than others. The Department of Justice, the Drug Enforcement Agency, have clear, sort of outlined principles and policies on how they deal with cannabis, how they deal with marijuana, how they deal with incarceration. But some less clear that people don't think about are agencies like the EPA. This summer, the EPA issued a notice about pesticides after a California grow operation inquired whether or not pesticides would be safe and what pesticides would be used. And the EPA, without doing any research, flat out denied because the growth of cannabis being illegal under federal law, they said did not meet, did not meet the guidelines established by the EPA for acceptable uses. So when you have agencies that are, presenting this based on the sort of circular information, and members of Congress, a handful of which who are still in office when they voted on the Controlled Substances Act in 1970, you see a growing policy gap between the decision makers in these agencies and the public. So cannabis and its derivative parts are currently Schedule 1 under the Controlled Substances Act. And the definitions for Schedule 1 are no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. And I think it's worthwhile to do a little bit of background about how cannabis originally ended up in Schedule 1. In the early 70s, President Nixon had been speaking with members of Congress to draft the Controlled Substances Act to be tough on crime, to be tough on drugs. He established a commission led by then former governor of Pennsylvania, Raymond Schaefer, to develop recommendations as to where marijuana cannabis should be regulated in the scheduling system. It was placed temporarily in Schedule 1 by a House Judiciary chair, basically saying, let's leave it here until we can figure out where we should put it. The commission did a full report and ended up recommending that marijuana be decriminalized and that there was no public health danger to the substance. However, the Nixon administration just decided to ignore these recommendations and continue to remain in Schedule 1. So a lot of the lawmakers that were involved in that process, I think, passed on that decision to their colleagues and to their staff, and we've seen it not move from Schedule 1 in over 40 years, despite a body of research that shows, while there's debate, I think, for the potential of abuse, there's certainly a growing body of research that says there is a medical value, and that to say that it has no accepted medical value is really, I think, a false statement. The schedules are ranked. Some people, I think there's a misconception, particularly with a lot of the advocates I work with. They say, well, cocaine's Schedule 2. There's no way that marijuana is less dangerous than cocaine. And that's not exactly how the scheduling works. It's by potential of abuse. And there's several factors that go into those decisions. But I think it's worth noting that fentanyl is currently Schedule 2. And in 24 of the nation's largest cities, fentanyl-related overdose deaths have increased nearly 600% from 2014 to 2016. And one of the factors that goes into determining potential for abuse is overdose and hospitalizations and overdose deaths. On the DEA's website, in their fact sheets titled Drugs of Abuse, they list cannabis as having no reported overdose in history. So to have a drug that has thousands and thousands of overdoses contributing massively to our opioid crisis be in a schedule deemed having a less potential of abuse than cannabis certainly raises a lot of eyebrows. In making their scheduling determinations, HHS relies on an 8-factor analysis, which Dr. Sisley, I think, will talk a little bit more about. And a key component of that is clinical trials and whether or not products can move through phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials. My background is the law and legislation, so I will certainly let Dr. Sisley handle that. Another issue that we come to is there is currently only one government facility that creates product for research for controlled substances. It's at the University of Mississippi at the NIDA Research Facility, and each year they'll establish quotas for how much product is released to the public for research purposes. So in 2008, there was 4,500 kilograms produced of full plant marijuana with 312 and change of tetrahydrocannabidiol, which are some of the process, some of the oils, and some of the tinctures. And I, frankly, do not have an explanation between 2010 and 2013 as to why only 21 kilograms were produced. But as you can see, between this year, 2017, and 2018, there's already been a decrease in the amount requested to be produced. And with over 30 pending applications for research purposes that haven't been acted on by the DEA in over a year, seeing a lower production quota is concerning. So really, as a case study to show why more research is important, in 2016, we had over 65,000 overdose deaths from prescription opioids, fentanyl, other substances. And in January of this year, the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicines reviewed over 10,000 studies and that for varying conditions for using cannabis to treat, and found that there was substantial and conclusive evidence that cannabis is effective in treating chronic pain. the pathway of addiction often with opioids results from either a minor injury, minor pain that turns into something where the individuals can't seem to find a way off these prescription pills. However, in a survey of 3,000 pain patients, 93% of them said they preferred medical cannabis over their prescription opioids. So having the high support from patients saying that this could be a viable tool, and looking at data from agencies like the National Academies, which organizations like the FDA rely on for their opioid data, really goes to show that this could be an option to help reduce the opioid crisis. Hospitalizations in medical cannabis states have been down 13%, and a study published in 2016 from the University of Georgia said doctors were writing 1,800 fewer prescriptions for opioids a year in medical cannabis states. And here's the big stat. In states with medical cannabis programs, it's been shown that there's been a 25% decrease in opioid overdose deaths. And that was in between 1999 and 2010. So it was really before a lot of states came online with their programs. A lot of states added chronic pain as a qualifying condition. So that's without really states trying to fight this crisis. If states made a targeted effort with medical cannabis programs to use it against the opioid crisis, I think that number would increase even more. So again, a lot of cannabis patients will often take opioids with their cannabis and find that there's a reduction in their use of opioids and of cannabis, and they work together to help manage their pain. And that's because our bodies have something called the endocannabinoid system. And the endocannabinoid system is inside all of us, and it works with cannabis through pain receptors, through CB1 and CB2 receptors, where the components of cannabis will bind with these receptors and reduce the need for other necessarily methods of pain management. And a recent study that actually came out just last week from New Mexico really highlighted these efforts. The study in New Mexico found that participants in the program, by almost a ratio of 17 to 1 who used cannabis compared to those who did not, were able to completely cease their use of opioids over a 6-month period. So the study was small, which I think is a problem with lots of cannabis studies, is that people are afraid to participate in them. They're afraid of the consequences. They're afraid of losing their jobs. They're afraid of losing their kids in a custody battle. And it's tough to get people involved in these studies while it remains illegal under federal law. But even with a small sample size, you see a tremendous result very quickly. The blue line up here is the patients involved in the medical cannabis program in New Mexico, and the comparison group is in orange. And the y-axis is the mean milligrams of morphine administered daily. So to see that quickly of a drop and that significant of a change really just, I think, highlights the need for not only more research, but the fact that this is a tool that's working. So that's it for like technical, but I'd love to talk to anybody who has questions about patient stories or really where the effort stands, either on the state level or on the federal level. And if not, I'll turn it to Sue.
This has been terrific. I'm learning so much from my colleagues who preceded me. The good thing is that I don't have to. I'm going to skip through a lot of this because these folks did such a good job of touching on a lot of important issues. So it frees me up to talk about some other things that we haven't yet dealt with. So this is probably what we're most known for. This clinical trial is an FDA-approved controlled trial looking at 76 military veterans with PTSD using 4 different strains of cannabis from the federal government. Let me see if this works here. Maybe not. Oh, there we go. Yeah, and so this is an FDA approved, so it's a federally regulated controlled trial. We're doing other research at Scottsdale Research Institute, but this is what we're most known for. These are our partners. Just a little bit about me is I'm a physician, so even though on the pamphlet you got it mentions that I'm with Scottsdale Research Institute, but I'm actually just I'm an MD. I'm not a traditional researcher. I learn, I develop research ideas from working with patients every day. I'm an internist. These are my disclosures. I don't participate in the industry at all, so I don't own grows and dispensaries, and I don't write recommendations for cannabis. I strictly focus on the science. The first bullet there is not true anymore. So I bring that up only because I want to be really open. I think it's important especially for professionals to talk openly about their use of cannabis. So for 46 years, I'd never tried cannabis, and then I got breast cancer this year, and I went through all the traditional surgery, radiation, but I refused chemo. I decided instead to utilize high THC oil to try to prevent recurrence. And so I think as Gail talked about the issue of stigma, so I think this is important, talking openly about folks who are using this. And this is part of why I made this decision. It's not something I encourage everybody to do, but I thought there was real science to support this. This is a colleague of mine at U of A who's doing studies. These are breast tumor cells, and he's basically utilized a synthetic cannabinoid. The breast tumor cells in a petri dish, and you see the density of the cells is dramatically diminished in the cells that were exposed to cannabis. And here's another great example of his work. These are mice models with cancer, and you can see that in the mice that were given cannabis oil, that they had dramatic reduction in the in the risk of spread of the tumor. So you see there's less incidence of metastasis, less growth of the primary tumor. So these are all things that compelled me to look at this. And my other disclosure, I want to make sure to mention that I'm on the board of Doctors for Cannabis Regulation, which is a really important charity. It's a kind of the collective voice of physicians in the U.S. that are trying to create a safe harbor for physicians to talk openly about the need to end cannabis prohibition. So even though I don't consider myself pro-cannabis, I'm just about social justice and the need to end what I think is a really insane drug policy. And so this is a website. I really encourage you to go look at this, dfcr.org. If you get a chance, to encourage your physicians to join this group. It's free to join, and it's a really worthy organization. So now I want to just mention the reason that this trial got so famous was because we ended up getting fired from the U of A. So we were at the University of Arizona. We had IRB approval to conduct this clinical trial, and ultimately we were terminated after years of conflict with the administration there, who did not value cannabis research and did not want this to occur at a public university where they felt it would harm their ability to draw down federal dollars. So ultimately, this was a huge gift to the study. We got 2 years of free media coverage, relentless coverage, which drew a big spotlight around the barriers to research. That was super valuable for the cannabis movement in general, because it really showed how the research is being impeded. So ultimately, we ended up in this research institute where we are happily independent of any university or hospital. And that's important for folks to know, that you don't have to do this work with the university. We're still doing federally regulated, federally legal research. without help of any university, and it's a great feeling. And after getting tossed out of the U of A, we ended up with a $2 million grant from the state of Colorado. We were the largest grant of the 8 projects that were awarded, but most importantly, I want to point out, these are the areas the projects that they funded. And you can see the good news is that over the next 3 years or so, you're going to see published data in all of these areas. Cannabis for pediatric brain tumors, cannabis for inflammatory bowel disease, all these things that people have legitimate clinical questions. And the state of Colorado, we owe them big gratitude for having the foresight to invest in this kind of work, because they only agreed to fund studies looking at efficacy, which is really important because there is no government money to study efficacy of cannabis, only safety studies, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more. So the reason we've been fighting so hard for this study is because it's the first and only controlled trial in the world looking at cannabis for PTSD. So that's why we could not stop, no matter how many barriers we ran into. We had to keep pushing on, and ultimately we ended up with what scientists call the golden ticket. It's the DEA Schedule 1 license. After 7 years of struggle with the government, we now have the privilege, I kind of put that in quotes, the privilege of purchasing cannabis from the University of Mississippi. And I will tell you that I assumed that when we ordered 8 kilos of cannabis from NIDA that it would come via armored truck or something similarly secure, but there was the FedEx guy showed up at the door of our lab, and he had, no idea he was transporting cannabis, and he looked very surprised why all the cameras were there, And and ultimately, you open up the cooler and it's basically frozen cannabis. It's been sitting in the freezer in the lockers of the DEA of NIDA for over 2 years, and it comes in these sandwich bags, basically these little Ziploc bags that we dump out and weigh to make sure that all the DEA accountability forms are met. But you can see, because I like to show this because I feel like it's important for the public to know that this is what we are forced to use for any controlled trials. It's like a kind of a green talcum powder. It's very strange consistency. It doesn't resemble what most of us know as cannabis. But you can see, let me see if this works here. You can see here that basically it's a lot of stems, sticks, powder. It's just, so one of the vets said, looks like lawnmower clippings. And this is the challenge, though, is that when you're forced to use, a lot of scientists believe that this sabotages efficacy studies from the beginning because one of the vets said this is like trying to make a 3 Michelin star meal using Vienna sausages. It's just really low quality plant material, and you're trying to measure effectiveness, but yet, remember, this study drug is given to patients by weight. So if half of the weight of the study drug is this sort of extraneous plant, what we want to study is the flowering part of the plant, but what we're forced to use is the entire, all this ground up material. So as soon, we were the first research team to actually do secondary testing on federal government cannabis. Surprising to me because you would think that that other scientists would be curious about what's in this, but nobody's ever done it, and it's because it's almost impossible. The DEA, in order to send this for testing, there's a chain of command with DEA cannabis, and you can't just send it to any lab. You got to send it to one that has a DEA Schedule 1 license, and very few have it, and they don't disclose who that is. It's a secret. So this is the problem is we spent months trying to cold call labs all around the country to find out who had a Schedule 1 license. We finally found one, and the data came back with excessively high levels of mold and lead. And so suddenly we had this dilemma of what to do. As a physician, for me to knowingly hand out moldy weed to veterans, it just felt really negligent. And so we had this big, debate among our research team, then engaged the FDA and IRB committees, and ultimately we published all of our data we did 3 rounds of testing. When we came out with this, it went viral right away. because this really confirmed what a lot of people already knew about the cannabis. They already knew, the public knows that the cannabis is really substandard, but now we finally had proof that, and when it's interesting, when I asked NIDA, I went back and said, what was your mold testing? You know, what were your counts? And they said, oh, we've never tested for mold. And I was like, wow, this is really stunning to me that, you know, every state, every legal medical cannabis state has certain threshold, or you got to meet, you know, it's like usually 10,000 CFU or less. And the fact that they've never tested since 1968, they've held this monopoly. And you think about all the patients who've been exposed to, you know, mold-laden cannabis, and you know, a lot of these folks are immunosuppressed. We did a lot of early controlled trials on HIV population. So it was really sad to me. And, you know, ultimately, our partners at Hopkins ended up dropping out of the study right away, because when we went public with this, they found that was, you know, they didn't want to be aligned with a group that was criticizing the government. That's what they felt, that it was, that we were being critical, and in fact, all we were trying to do was be transparent with the public. And so they dropped out. It was fine. They didn't have any enrollment by the time they dropped out, so they didn't hurt the study in any way. We're continuing on with all their enrollment is happening in Phoenix, and it's going well. We're about halfway through the study. We already have 30 vets that have completed the protocol. I want to show you, let me just jump here to a little bit later, because I just want to show you, a lot of people have probably never seen how a cannabis trial works. So I want to just give you a glimpse of our actual protocol. Let me see if I have some, there we go. So this is the actual study, in case you probably never seen the details of how, so this is, you know, actually, let me just see here. Let me jump a little bit further here. Oh, sorry, that was our talk at the American Legion. Let me see. Sorry. There we go. Okay. Let's pull a little forward there. Okay, so basically, this is a triple blind randomized controlled trial. So triple blind just means that everybody's blinded in the study. So that's how we eliminate any chance of human bias. We make sure all the study subjects, all the veterans are blinded. They don't know what they're getting. None of the study coordinator, like me, none of the docs know what they're on, and none of the independent raters know. So, so that's all that means. And then let me jump to, this thing doesn't, there, we'll go to this. And so that's why, because it was important to me that, you know, the issue with, you know, we were forced to be activists in order to get this study under. I just wanted to do the study, and instead we end up constantly fighting the government for 7 years to get through all these blockades. And so I wanted the public to be reassured that there was no way, we create a study design that's impenetrable to anybody having some kind of agenda, that, you know, you can't fudge the results in any way. So you can see here's the actual, so these are different ratios of THC to CBD are what we're using. This is all the government gives us. So you can't ask for unique cannabinoids like say you want to study CBN or CBG or THCV, you can't get that. You can get THC and CBD in different ratios. So these are the 4 arms of the study. You get one batch that's high in THC. It's about 10% THC. That's the highest you can get out of our government. And then a high CBD, and then a 1-to-1 ratio of THC to CBD, and then a placebo control, which is surprising. They do have a placebo. It actually does work. Even we've had experienced cannabis users who've been fooled by placebo. It's the same stuff. It's same cannabis plant. They just alcohol wash it and they leach out all the cannabinoids and terpenes. So then what we do is we introduce them to the cannabis through these that's like a 4-hour starter session that they're required to do on 2 consecutive days. So at that point, we administer the marijuana to them and see how they react to it. We document all their experience, good and bad. and make sure they tolerate it, you know, 'cause some of these guys are totally new to cannabis. It's kind of a mix. Some vets are naive, some vets are experienced. That wasn't an issue. We wanted we wanted a good mix. And so we monitor them, and then at the end of that, they go into do the same thing the next day, and we see how they react to it. If they do okay in those 2 sessions, then they end up going to stage 1, which is 3 weeks of home self-titration, where they're actually allowed to take the cannabis home with them each week and use it as they want to. So that is, and then they get cut off study drug for 2 weeks, and then they get re-randomized to a brand new strain of cannabis. So if they were on high THC in stage 1, they might get put on high CBD in stage 2. It's all random. And the good news is there's no placebo in stage 2, so they're guaranteed some active study drug. But I just want to give you a glimpse. I don't want to get too far into that, but now I'm going to end with, I just want to talk to you guys about the barriers to research that David touched on. Just want to dig a little deeper in that, and then we'll finish. So the issue that always fascinates me, my study sponsor is MAPS, which many of you know. MAPS is a nonprofit that does all the seminal psychedelic studies in the U.S. They're the ones that are taking MDMA through the entire FDA protocol. And so they, what's amazing though is, so I get a chance to contrast our work with MDMA against cannabis. And even though we started at the same time, we have cannabis is still just, this study I'm doing right now is an FDA phase 2 trial. So it's right at the beginning of the FDA process, whereas MDMA is almost at the end of the FDA process. It's already at the end of phase 3 trials. So it's unbelievable. Like, I think all of us agree it's absurd that cannabis is in Schedule 1 at all, but the fact that it's more difficult to study than any other drug in Schedule 1, I think doesn't make any sense to anybody. And, you know, here, I'm a lifelong Republican, so to me, I view this as just kind of classic federal government overreach, that they're trying to micromanage every aspect of this. And here's the thing, if you want to study any controlled substance in the US, you have to go through those 3 agencies, which is fine. Nobody's disputing that. But the problem that we've had all along is that cannabis has always been treated more harshly than all the other drugs in Schedule 1. With cannabis, you've had to go through these 2 additional agencies, Public Health Service and NIDA, and those 2 agencies don't have any timetable. So they can take 10 years to review your study, and that's exactly how they impeded this research. They took 3 years to review our protocol, even if it had already been approved by the FDA. So this is a second redundant review that occurred after FDA approval, and you can see, you know, during that time of waiting, 24,000 veterans killed themselves in the U.S., and we wonder, could cannabis have helped curb this epidemic of veteran suicide? We're not studying that specific question with this clinical trial, but so the good news is that we managed, after we went through that awful experience, we managed to persuade the government. We spent, you know, a full year lobbying and got Obama to end the PHS review, which had been in place for 4 decades and was clearly impeding clinical trials. So, so that happened, but there's still the biggest barrier to cannabis research is what David touched on, is this DEA NIDA monopoly. So that's why I was asking, why is it that, you know, here we have FDA approval, we're fully funded, yet we can't get started, and that's because of this monopoly. So for those of you who are unaware, since 1968, University of Mississippi has enjoyed a government-enforced monopoly on the only federally legal supply of cannabis for any controlled trials. And this is Dr. El Soli, who heads up that facility. He's got his hand in a barrel of ground-up cannabis. That's what they do. They throw the entire plant into a grinder and then roll it up into cigarettes that are shipped out to all the scientists who are doing all the safety studies for NIDA. And you can see it's a lot of stems and sticks. Again, these are all pictures from our other investigators. But the challenge is that, yeah, we would like to use the flowering part of the plant, right, where we believe the maximum medicine and maximum density is. So let me just leave you with this. Other countries have multiple growers for research. The reason that DEA is blocking, that, you know, is trying to protect their monopoly there's a ton of politics involved here, but I just want to point out, look at all the other countries that have multiple growers for research. And the fact is that you can see, we can't get what strains, what phenotypes we're requesting. We can't get the potency we want. We can't get it in a timely manner. We don't have any access to information about the study drug. We've requested over and over through legal, through FOIA and other ways to what's in this. They won't share it. And yet, when I do other clinical trials, you always get a drug master file, a DMF, that tells you exactly what's in your study drug, but here you don't. And these guys are taking $68 million in taxpayer money every 5 years to keep their monopoly going. So this is not a violation. Ending the monopoly would not violate international treaty, despite what the DEA says. That's a bogus argument they're making. And other countries, obviously. But now we have unlikely allies, like the head of NIDA, Nora Volkow, has even admitted at a U.S. Senate hearing, she testified that, yes, her monopoly is a barrier to research. So this was really powerful when this came out, because she's acknowledging that this country would be better off without her monopoly. And no, it doesn't. There is no other Schedule I drug that has to do this. Like when we buy MDMA for our other studies, we don't go through NIDA. You don't go through 1A. You can buy, research grade LSD or MDMA from any lab in the country. Only cannabis has this situation. So just want to leave you with this. This is the actual language of the Controlled Substances Act. Here it shows you, let me see if I can, must provide an adequate and uninterrupted supply of cannabis for any clinical trials. And that they've been in violation of this, language for many years. They've never, waiting 20 months for cannabis is not an uninterrupted supply. Not being able to get any of the, and I want to just show you one last thing that a lot of people aren't aware of. Let me just go back to, so NIDA cannabis is not allowed to be used as a prescription medicine, right? So our effort with this trial we're doing right now is to put whole plant cannabis through the entire FDA drug development process. You can see here, FDA does not allow, anything that any phase 3 trial that you do, whatever the study drug that you use for phase 3 is a drug you have to go to market with. Well, you can't go to market with NIDA marijuana. The cannabis from University of Mississippi is only allowed for academic research, not drug development research. So this is the kind of the big untold story in our country, is that there is no study drug for phase 3 trials. So this is what is preventing, if any of us wanted to put the cannabis through the entire FDA drug development process, we can't do that. Like in 2 years, we will be ready to move into phase 3 trials. We won't have any drug supply for phase 3. That's why it is so essential to do what David mentioned, which is licensing other growers for research. We must do that, because if we don't, we will get to phase 3 in 2 years and we won't be able to do anything with that. We won't be able, and the problem is that if you can't get through the FDA process, we'll never really be able to persuade the physician community. The medical community doesn't believe anything is a medicine unless it's put through the entire FDA process. So this is a very specific barrier to getting physicians on board now, because if we can't do phase 3 trials, we'll never be able to really persuade the physician community that this is so. So let me end it with that. This is the applications that Dave was talking about. These are, there's 30 applications sitting on the desk of the DEA. So if there's any call to action I could give you, it's please let's put pressure on the DEA to make good on their pledge. They made an announcement a year and a half ago that they would license other growers for research. That announcement was made under the Obama administration, and of course, nothing has moved forward since then under Trump. So let's see if we can keep the pressure on the DEA to make good on their pledge, follow through, and start to license other growers for research. Thank you all very much. What's that? Oh, the mold problem. Yeah, so the FDA and the DEA, NIDA, all suggested that we irradiate the cannabis, the study drug that they gave us, which I thought was really interesting because, why are we now in charge of remediating the cannabis that you sold to us? It's amazing that we have to then doctor it to, and by the way, there's no evidence that, that that's safe to do without harming the potency. I mean, the potency is already so low, and if you irradiate it, supposedly the cannabinoid content diminishes, and so then suddenly we have the same problem where we don't have, then we won't know what's, so we decided our second and third round of testing still showed excessively high levels of mold, but not sky high. It was more in the range of what might be acceptable in some states. And because it's a smoking study, veterans are smoking, we presume that a lot of the mold spores would be combusted in that process and it might not be harmful. But this is a very suboptimal situation. And after conferring with FDA and IRB, they felt that all we need to do is make it clear in the informed consent with these vets that, look, cannabis is a natural product that has contaminants like mold and things. So we literally put that in the ICF, and we review that with all the folks who sign up for the study, and they all seem to still want to do it in spite of that. But yeah, it's pretty discouraging that this is, taxpayer dollars being wasted on, just not even to mention the study itself, $2 million to study this lousy study drug is really discouraging. So, yeah.
Is DEA really serious about licensing other grows? Because I'm hearing that what they require is outrageous and hard to really go by. And then anybody who's looking at it is almost throwing out their hands saying there's no way we can comply with this.
Yeah, that's what's interesting. I don't think anybody knows the DEA position yet. Chuck Rosenberg, he already left, right? Chuck. Yeah, so Chuck had said that he wanted to license other growers for research, but that DOJ was blocking him. So it's like each of these agencies are sort of pointing fingers at each other, and I'm not sure where the, I'm not sure. We'll see who this new director. They haven't appointed anyone yet for DEA. Okay, so we'll see if the new DEA director has the political muscle to make it happen. But it doesn't look good right now. It looks pretty grim if they'll ever, anytime the DEA makes an announcement without a timeline, we're screwed because, they're experts in delay, as you can see by our experience with them. So let me ask, maybe, do you want to bring everybody up and we can take questions for all? Oh, 2 questions? Okay, you got it. Yeah, let's see if you guys, does anybody else have any other questions for our group here?
Sue, I have a question about the placebo arm. You had patients go through the whole.
Yes.
So were they aware, could they tell, because that study that's going on in Israel with the autism patients, I heard that when they were switched over to the placebo arm, the breakthrough effects were so dramatic that they actually stopped the placebo arm of that study.
Isn't that something? Wow.
So did you have any experience with someone saying,
Yes,
I'm
yes.
not getting effectiveness, I must be on the placebo?
Sure, yeah.
It breaks the blood.
Yes, that's a big problem in cannabis studies in general, is the placebo, developing an effective placebo that really keeps the blinding is next to impossible. And the challenge too is because they've eradicated all the cannabinoids and terpenes, there's not even, and so they're using the same plant material, so it looks and smells the same as the other batches. But if you're an experienced user, you're right. We've had some vets who have known, because I can tell by the way they use it, the guys who stop using it right away at the beginning of their 3-week, you can, and I talk to them and they say, I'm sure this is placebo. But then other vets who are naive to cannabis, I'm not sure. See, and since we're all blinded, I don't even know what to make of that yet, but we'll see later when in another 2 years, we unblind all the data. So I'll be able to tell you more specifically how they reacted.
I have a question
Yeah,
for you.
yeah.
Are you, as a researcher, ever tempted if you have a person who has a certain condition, say, hey, try this to, make notes on the side to see if they're getting a benefit from a certain quality?
Yes, yeah, we do that for sure. Even though I don't write recommendations, but I have a lot of patients who use cannabis, and so I'm definitely documenting their experiences in my medical charts and trying to understand. So that's what's so frustrating is when you see I'm always mystified why, like, you hear people's experiences with cannabis, they're so profound and transformative, and yet you look at the controlled trials and the efficacy just doesn't reflect the patient experiences, which are often completely transformative. So I think that's the issue, is partly that these studies are forced to use this low quality study drug, but also because we always do these fixed dosing models in controlled trials, we always make people take like 50 milligrams 3 times a day. And we fought really hard to keep a patient self-titration model. Like, so the patients in our study get to adjust their dose based on their symptoms. And that's really the best model, I think, for botanical medicine, especially for cannabis, that they should be able to use what they want and stop and not be, if you force people to take, like that Don Abrams study, remember the pain study, where he forced people to take that much 50 milligrams TID, and they ended up having tons of side effects because a lot of the vets in our study only needed a minute amount. Some of these guys were just vaping, I'm sorry, not vape, some of these guys were smoking like 2 or 3 puffs at night, and that's enough to completely sedate them. And, you know, so anyway, yeah, that's, anybody else? Oh, yeah.
Yep. Well, recently in the news there was this story about this 11-month-old baby who overdosed on marijuana, and I'm sure that it impacted everybody in the business, and it since has kind of gone away. But what was the downfall? What was the
Dave,
backlash?
did Asa say something
Sure.
about that?
That'd be you, I think.
Oh,
Dave, or Michael.
yeah.
Yeah, what was interesting about that story is almost immediately after, about 6 hours after, the physicians involved basically realized that what they said was not exactly accurate, that the overdose with the infant was not directly related to cannabis. It was a contributing factor, and they wanted to assuade everybody that what they had meant was that it was not directly correlated, that it was a contributing factor, but it was not necessarily the cause. And I think that
This was fake news.
I don't know if I necessarily want to say it was fake news, but the story was shortly recanted afterwards. And I do want to add the importance of why that shows why this needs to be well regulated. When you have things on the black market, you don't have labels, you don't have dosing guidelines, you don't have child safety caps. So to have that story come out, I think, is a good wake-up call for the industry, saying, hey, we need to have our products be in child-proof containers. We need our products to be well labeled. We need to say how much THC versus CBD and other cannabinoids are in there. And, you know, in the event that it did actually cause an overdose, I think that's an important message for the work that we do, to say that, hey, well, it is considerably safer than a lot of traditional medications that have gone through the FDA process. There are still risks, and I don't think anybody who's in the cannabis industry would say that there are not side effects to cannabis and there aren't risks, but it's about measuring those risks and knowing how to effectively respond to them.
Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you.